Muito bom dia a todas e a todos. Esta mesa redonda tem como ponto de partida uma reflexão sobre o tema da cultura nas periferias.
Roundtable is the topic culture in peripheries. Peripheries in its different dimensions, geographic, social and cultural, highlighting how they interfere with artistic and cultural production and access to culture and arts, and how they influence public policy. Enhanced by diversity and complexity of this context. To speak about this topic, founded on their long experience, we have with us Magda Enriquez and Fatima Al-Sada, with intense experience in cultural management and the development of cultural and artistic projects in different forms and institutional contexts of both public and private nature. In common, they have a journey experience during a period of intense change in the country. Founded on the international vocation of Portugal. In a period where we can also observe intense acceleration in relationships between center and peripheries, both nationally and internationally, with an overlapping of new and old sectors and peripheries of growing meaning. Here, at the center of the discussion, are the challenges of public development of public policies in the cultural, artistic, and social domains. To introduce Fatima Al-Sada, she is currently a member of the organizer team of the application of Évora to European Cultural Capital. She was assistant to cultural programming of Portugal, Porto 2021. She collaborated with Feira Viva in Santa Maria da Feira, responsible for mediation with audiences at the medieval festival. From 2004-2010, she was programming assistant of Vila Flor Cultural Center, where she founded a new educational center. From 2010 and 2011, she was coordinator of the Imaginários Festival in Santa Maria da Feira. She also founded the Educational Service Center at Estareja Cultural Center. She was also artistic director of the Theatre of Alvar and artistic director of O Festa and Incomuns Concerts. From 2020 to 2022, she was artistic director of Oficina. Magda Enriquez, artistic director in Minho and art history professor at the Contemporary Performance Institute. She has collaborated with different festivals and entities like Fundação Serralves, Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian, and different theaters. She was also coordinator of the Education Center Amoajo and in Fundão. From 2008 to 2012, she was coordinator of the educational project fine arts, plastic arts in Coimbra. I give the floor to Magda Henriques for her speech on this topic.
Muito obrigada, Américo. Bom dia a todos e a todas. Foi difícil preparar.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked to speak based on my experiences to address the topic of this panel. So I looked at the word periphery and I recalled my experience when I read the word slavery. I was deeply disturbed. So when preparing this session, I thought that perhaps we were not speaking about peripheries, but rather peripherized territories and individuals. All of my life was developed between centers and peripheries. I grew up in Sozelas, the periphery of a city, Coimbra. I was 1 year and a half when we had the revolution in 1974, and strange people arrived at my village. They were strange, but I liked them. They brought with them theater, drama, and other activities that they conducted with both children and adults. Later, I found out that these were people who were part of the cultural dynamization program. Part of this also, the poet Sofia de Melbreyer in the assembly gave her speech. She said that culture is not a luxury but a fundamental need of all people and all communities. Culture does not exist to embellish life, but rather to transform it so that mankind may build in full awareness, in truthfulness, and with justice. I was a teenager in the 1980s. I studied in Coimbra, not in the most glamorous neighborhood, but in a school that above all had students from the unprivileged neighborhoods of the peripheries. I liked music, the arts. I liked the marginalized, but not of the existence of the marginals. Students would gather in the main square of the city, and we came from all sorts of social contexts. Meanwhile, I graduated in art history by the University of Porto, and I started teaching while simultaneously being part of the educational service of Serralves Modern Art Museum. I realized that the classroom has as many worlds as the number of people inside it. In 1990, a museum like Serralves was very new to the country, and it would attract extraordinarily all kinds of people and groups. At that time, the whole country seemed to gather in Serralves. Then, as today, the country was made up of very different realities. School groups would come from all parts of the country. Some would visit the museum in the morning and then visit shopping malls in the afternoon. We had groups of all ages and of all social and geographic origins. Groups organized by parish councils of more or less remote villages, foreigners. Robert Smith said, "Girl, I'll never again say that tarmac is ugly." Social groups that would look at Mangolden's picture and would say, "You see, this is us." Students from art schools occupied their places. and most of them would enter free of charge, because that place was consumed as a forum for discussion open to all. The educational services were responsible for creating the conditions so that all people in their diversity, and at the time we were well aware of diversity, and today there is much more plurality and diversity. And then we were told that the educational service was responsible for creating the conditions to ensure that people in their diversity felt comfortable before the discomfort caused by most exhibitions. I worked all over the country in museums and theaters, in the so-called large urban centers or in small festivals and small associations in so-called small peripheries. Nowadays, I am responsible for a project, Comédias do Minho, which take place precisely in the north of Portugal. And the foundation, its inception in 2020 was a assumption that culture is not only for the privileged. It takes place in very small towns, which realized that after guaranteeing the so-called basic needs, it was necessary to provide cultural offer. In 2007, in view of enhancing and expanding access, in other words, democratization of culture and cultural democracy simultaneously, with Isabel Alves Costa and Miguel Honrado, Comédias do Minho became a pedagogical and community project as well. 20 years later, after several mayors and political parties later, this project continues only thanks to ties of trust which are maintained through multiple actors. One of the issues raised here was, or one of the questions raised here was, who are these cultural sponsors who work in the peripheries, and if we consider ourselves to be in the peripheries. Let me thus come back to the concept of periphery. After all, what do we talk about when we talk about periphery? Peripheral in relation to what? Peripheral because it is far from the territories with high population density and where we find economic and political power, in other words, decision centers. Peripheral because it's poor. Poor of what? Poor. Peripheral because it's far from what? From Lisbon to Minho. The distance is exactly the same from Minho to Lisbon. Periphery because it is invisible and it's not in this, not under the limelights. And peripheral because it doesn't share the same tastes. The fact is it's peripheral to a large extent due to the viewpoint. As Maria Filomena Mulder said, our point of view segregates mistakes or errors. From the perspective of a tree, so from the perspective of a tree, if we can imagine from Minho to Açores, they are probably richer centers, more densely populated than Lisbon and Porto. But we speak of periphery as invisibility, and thinking of this cultural world, the process of polymerization is invisible and to that extent peripheral. Nothing against the holophotes in seeds. Seeds develop in the dark and in silence. I like the dark. And coming back to the question, what do cultural actors face? Which challenges do actors in the periphery face? I would say that they are very similar to the large centers. To a large extent, they concern glamour, dimension, and visibility of the places and the projects, much more than to deep differences. As for the challenges we face, we will find the fascination for the amount of fireworks. In the Middle Ages, the church, the bell tower, was the villages competed for the tallest bell tower. Now they compete for the biggest festivals and walkways, and the longest walkways. The other question was whether we consider ourselves to be in the periphery in our cultural context. Comedies do not occupy the periphery in their context. We have political and financial support and recognition. We don't believe that comedias is a periphery, but rather a promise, because we rapidly ensure a more balanced distribution, or our capacity to live in the planet will reduce. Centers, large centers like Lisboa, Porto, and Paris, we feel like a sinking ship. Therefore, peripheries are a promise of the future. May we be able to fulfill it, to be able to build a world composed of different centralities which are very diverse amongst themselves. And coming to the end, I would like to say that several questions were raised here, which I would like to have time to answer later. But to conclude, I would like to say that I think that we need to urgently pick up our pencils and draw different representation models. And by talking of different representation models, I conclude with a quote from Eduardo Galeano, where he evokes many peripheral and peripheran voices. And he says, in a text with the title, Ways of Much Festivities, the human voyage began in Africa. From there, our grandparents learned the conquest of the planet, and the sun was in charge of the distribution of colors. Now, men and women have more colors than the rainbow in the sky, but we are all African immigrants. Even the whitest whites come from Africa. Perhaps we are refusing to acknowledge our common origin because racism causes amnesia, because in those remote times the world was our world of no boundaries, and our legs were the only passport demanded. Thank you. The interpreter would like to apologize, but the lady was reading a written speech that was not provided to the interpreters.
Inicial 10 minutos.
Perdão. Muito bom dia.
I would like to give the floor to Seven now. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you very much, Art and Red, for organizing this conference. it is always a very important moment to actually get together and discuss these topics. Americo spoke about my professional background. I don't want to speak to you about that, but I'd like to share with you a few stories, a few cases, a few experiences that I feel are relevant throughout my life, relevant for what we've been speaking about, for what brings us here. I've been working for over 20 years now, and it was only recently that I started to think, about where is it that I work at, and for whom do I work. I think the need to do things most of the times does not allow us the opportunity to actually think about these things. Well, nevertheless, I've got to understand that I've always been working in peripheral contexts. This was not a conscious option. It's a result of opportunities that just, came up along the way, and that made sense to me. Now, this idea of periphery is a can be applied in many ways. When Álvaro Domingos was speaking, he showed this map of Portugal with small dots with hotter colors and colder colors, and I looked at the map, and in fact, the places where I've developed my activity are in areas that had a hotter color. So when I looked at the map, I could actually consider that I've developed my activity away from peripheries. But when I think in terms of peripheries, and I work in peripheries, this idea goes beyond the aspect of geography. It's more along the lines of the art concept, cultural concept, that is connected to the word periphery. Along these lines, I would like to share with you a few things that may help us to reflect which are the specificities of peripheries. One of the words that I associate to the idea of periphery is the idea of being invisible. How to make this invisibleness less evident, meaning to make these territories more evident. I'd like to share with you my experience in Ovar. Now, Ovar is the place where I was born. It's a small city by the coast, very close to Oporto and Aveiro. It is 30 kilometers away from Oporto, the second town in the country, and the city of Aveiro. It is a privileged context. We have a railway, a big industry, context of accessibility, and we could think that this territory would not be a peripheral territory. I was born there. I never had the opportunity to work there until 2014. And it was then that the mayor invited me to go to Ovar and to work there and think about a project for a municipality, more than programming or being the head of the cultural center. They wanted me to think about the city and its territory, more than the city, the municipality. So beyond the borders of the city. And I decided to accept. I was very enthusiastic, and I felt that it would be a possibility to actually start something, to actually start almost from scratch. That's what I thought I would be doing. I was there for 5.5 years. It was a very interesting work, discovery of what existed and possibilities of doing things. When I got to Ovar, I thought I knew town. I understood that there was a whole context that I needed to be familiar with in order to use it, to work with it. This was a city that, because it was laying between two more important towns, got used to the fact that cultural practices were almost non-existent. You know, Oporto and Aveira were so close that the people responsible for the municipality did not feel that they should invest in culture, and populations just got used to this because they could use either a car or train to go to Aveiro or to Oporto to go to to see a play or to attend a cultural event. And so what we did, was to create a program for that city that would make sense for those, for the people that lived there, but also that made sense for the artists that we invited and also for the territories, so that we could be more attentive to what was going on. And the way we worked in Ovar, my team, was to actually connect all the equipments we thought about the city in a broader manner. We connected the museum to the School of Arts and Crafts. We thought how we could use the different equipment and how the different equipments could feed each other, work in a network of resources as a team, and work with the people and with the local people and institutions. We would never do much in that territory if we ignored cultural associations, amateur groups, and the other cultural agents. So this was the way we decided to go forward. We worked together with different actors, with people that had different experiences, and we also invited people from outside. And this method bear its fruit, and it was very interesting because we were able to actually create spectacles, create workshops, see art, and the territory, in fact, affirmed itself before its population and also before the national artistic community. And until then, it had remained invisible. So this was the story that I wanted to share with you, this story of Ovar. Another story has to do, it is very different, something that happened in Guimarães. Guimarães is a much bigger town. It was some years back the European capital of culture, with a very diverse offer when it comes to programming, but that was very much focused in the city and not in the surrounding territory. And a project that I developed when I last worked in Guimarães had to do with education and culture, because we understood that cultural spaces and the initiatives, the cultural initiatives, were attended by people that lived in the center of town. This is a municipality that has 62 parishes. So we created a project that started in schools, and we're speaking about public education. We provided art schools on a weekly basis. We got the children to attend different events such as workshops, conferences, and involved both of SIN, the institution where I was working, and the municipality of Guimarães, and together we understood that those children and their teachers were so far away from what happened in the city. Sometimes they were just 2 kilometers away from the city. So in this case, we're speaking of yet another periphery. And this project, which is still ongoing with some changes, try to actually bridge or to actually create other possibilities to fight against this lack of visibility of these communities and their relationship with art and cultural practices. And I think that this brings me to the end of my time. Well, thank you very much. A round of applause to you as well. And now maybe we should develop these topics a little bit. They have been addressed by these two first interventions. I have a question for both of you. In the multiplicity of connections between center and periphery, we can identify in Portugal's situations of periphery vis-à-vis big cities such as Lisbon and Oporto, and opposite we have the innermost regions of the country. What kind of specificities and challenges do you feel feature these two main categories of peripheries that exist in Portugal when it comes to people, resources, development, or even participation in art and cultural projects? What kind of instruments are there available, and how can we establish a dialogue with local powers, both locally, regionally, and let me add, nationally? What kind of mechanisms or coordination of cultural or artistic nature exist in the territory? And please reflect on the articulation of this action with other areas of besides culture. Well, those are actually lots of questions. It's just one single question, but I enjoyed using this expression of innermost regions of Portugal. Well, we were speaking about that with Álvaro Domingos. Would you like to kick off, Fatima? Could you please be more precise? Well, let us, think of this one. What kind of instruments or supports do we have, and how do we articulate in the planning for artistic and cultural projects? And, what about a dialogue with the powers, political powers? How do your artistic projects, what was your relationship with the power? What is your experiences that did you have that idyllic environment of total trust and empathy? How does that work? Let us center on this relationship with power. Well, I can speak about my experience, and most specifically of Comédias do Minho. I recall also another project I was involved in Fundão, at Moagem. So I'll speak about the project of Comédias. Well, no interference whatsoever of political powers vis-à-vis the work we developed in artistic terms. And in fact what exists, and this is not in an idyllic way, because the idyllic aspect has a less idyllic side. I think there are some dangers in it. You know, the relationship that was created, the trust relationship that was created. It is also important to say that I've been involved in this group for the last 6 years, so we've built this relationship for several years now. On the one hand, it is very important, but on the other hand, it brings along some absence when it comes to their presence, and their presence to actually know what is going on from their own experience. I don't know whether I'm being clear enough. So essentially, this is what I feel in terms of this relationship. We also have mediators. I feel this is very important, that make this bridge, between us and the political power. We have several layers in this process. And I'm speaking about municipal technicians that are very important. They remain when mayors leave, when politicians leave. Those people are there on a permanent basis, and they are the ones that actually allow that these projects, which are very easy to destruct but very difficult to actually build. And I was saying these people are very interesting, very important to actually maintain these experiences. The experience was to actually speak about the rest of the country, based on your experience. Well, I don't know enough, and I don't think I should issue an opinion on that. Well, my experience is slightly different from Magda's. Well, I worked for several municipalities, different political parties, and most of the times, that's what is less important. We're speaking about local politicians that are very close to people and to their communities. And I believe that, in fact, we have very few cases in Portugal where political powers, and when I speak about political powers, I'm speaking about local power, municipalities, and these local powers consider the importance of having ideas for culture, for the use of equipments, development of cultural and artistic activities, and they respect this and they do not interfere. Unfortunately, my experience makes me understand that in many cases there is a very clear idea that culture, or budgets for culture and cultural practices, are very important, and they have a tremendous impact in the life of people and in the communication that is made and in the image resulting from that. But in many cases there is this big temptation of using this as an instrument, of using what is done as an instrument. So in many cases there is an interference. Sometimes, it's a very open interference, but in some other instances things tend to be more hidden. But in most of the scenarios there is a strong interference in our work, in the cultural and artistic work of the different teams of and organizations from political powers. But usually we feel that there is a will to actually to promote some kind of municipalization of culture. How do you feel about this? This trend to municipalize culture, meaning municipalities being responsible for all cultural activities of their municipality. Well, because it is something I've witnessed in my professional activity, and it is something that I've seen more during the last years. I mean, what I feel, and during the last 20 years, I've seen that there is a bigger trend for this municipalization of culture. Municipalities embrace, I want to use a soft word, all the initiatives, they control them and they implement them. And that is increasingly more visible, not only in some of the municipalities I've worked in, but in other contexts as well. That is something that we can see increase. Well, I think that this, as far as I'm concerned, has a lot to do with what I said during my presentation, that actually concerns me a lot. And it has to do with the amount, of things that are done. I mean, doing a lot, and with a glamour, even when it has no glamour at all. And it sort of goes along the lines of what Fatima was mentioning, and it has to do also with some lack of knowledge in these areas, knowledge that does not exist, that the people that have this power do not have. These very important festivals that are very similar and that are on news bulletins, and they tend to monopolize everything that happens in the territory. I'm also curious to know whether you can point out any public policy initiative that in some way values peripheral projects that are developed outside Lisbon and Oporto. I mean, do you recognize any effort, and what is that, in order to value projects that are implemented outside Lisbon and Oporto, and actually treat them the same way they do when compared to projects that occur in Lisbon and Oporto, and whether this can contradict the issue of visibility, or whether you feel that there are no initiatives that could be included in this rather.
Personally, I feel that the network can be a good example of capacity building in these municipalities by providing support. And the microphone of the lady is failing, so giving different visibility to the equipment, to the facilities. So it's a good first step for local power to understand that central power and central government is paying attention to the rest of the country and is creating mechanisms for the rest of the country beyond Lisbon. I think that this is a good sign. And this is essential for cultural managers, cultural producers. And I'm sorry, but the microphone is failing. It is also one way of raising the awareness of local power, local politicians who realize that they also must adopt a different stance before culture. And we have lost sound. In my view, yes, we should value this gesture, but don't forget the dangers if simultaneously we do not acknowledge other dimensions, not only the enhancement of knowledge and training of stakeholders, but also, above all, by not valuing projects that are less specific and less visible, and those projects which sometimes are less visible but are not necessarily less important. So that action that is important, all the while can also help kill other projects, which in my view, without which, in my view, will lead to standardization again. So we are left with 3 minutes for discussion, so I now give the floor to the audience. Questions for Fatima and Magda?
Thank you. I always have comment about this, that we have 3 minutes about peripheries and central and decentralization dialogue. At the end, we have centralized communication because we have speakers there speaking and not space for the audience to participate. So it's really paradox that we are speaking about changes using the old paradigm. I really want to emphasize this moment of structuring the conversation. From other side, I think I don't hear enough political discourse, because if we speak about a center and peripheries, this is about power. What center creating as a center, it's a power. What kind of power? It's a military power, or it's economical power, or what? But what is the problem? Because who create this paradigm of center and periphery, and how we accept this? Because the game of the power is accepting the discourse and models that are providing by powers. So is it possible that we think otherwise, to change the roles? Because as a question, who is barbarian, who is civilization in the context of colonialization? Because sometimes it's a question, who is really barbarians? The people who are from West, when they go to peripheries to colonize these people, they treated there as barbarians. But atrocities that these colonizers did there, it was really barbarian things. So it's always questions, what is the center, what is the periphery, from which perspective we are watching this, from which understanding of the power and the meaning of life and the meaning of politics we are watching this. So is it possible somehow to change this paradigm and not to accept the models and paradigms that are providing as a soft power from the centers of power? Maybe I'm not so clear, but okay.
Muito obrigado. Querem comentar, responder? Magda.
Na perspectiva, se calhar, tem graça porque...
Funny, because I began by saying that it was very hard for me to prepare this session in such short a time, and I actually forgot to show these pictures, which apparently have nothing to do with Comédias do Minho in relation to creating different narratives and different perspectives. And I should say that this picture, I'm sorry, you're not seeing the pictures. I thought you were seeing the picture I have before me, says the speaker. Can we show it on the screen? Well, not to take any longer, essentially what I wanted to say, and which I started saying, a project like Comédias do Minho was not intended as a peripheric project. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to talk about Comédias do Minho, and not only, and this is why I didn't only focus on Comédias do Minho, because we are often mention Comédias do Minho for discussions like these, not because they are peripheral, but because they are in Minho, so far from Lisbon or Porto. But this is what we are trying to some extent to deconstruct. And I didn't show these pictures that I had at the end of my presentation because I was running out of time. But in view of enhancing the need to build new perspectives, new outlooks, and new views, I had these pictures to build the bridge between Eduardo Galeano and Álvaro Domingues when he this morning asked us, who are we who are here in Melgaço, but in the end are from all over the world. When we talk of paradigm changes, I understand perfectly well what you're saying, where you're coming from, and of course we need to work on change, but to change essentially in the meanings that we lend. The issue of peripheries. Periphery is always in relationship to something, because everything is peripheral in relation to something. So as it is peripheral, it can also be central. And there can be an exchange of roles. So this paradigm change, which I believe is essential, will be in the meanings that we lend to the idea of periphery, to the concept of periphery, because we all understand that we always lend a very negative, pejorative meaning to periphery, because it's what is far from the center, far from the power, far from what is important. But it might not be necessarily so. So if we change this symbolism or meaning that we lend to periphery, then a lot can change. Actually, a lot has changed. Magda said precisely that Comédias do Minho are very central and fundamental in that region. They are not peripheral in relation to anything, and they don't need to be. I hope I answered your question. I have just been told that we need to end here. Thank you very much for your participation and also the participation of the